Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here amongst you, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion and questions, especially during the question and answer period. It's, as you guys know, the Sudan and the issue of peace and conflict resolution is a very convoluted issue that it's impossible to really try to nail it down in 1 hour, but I will try to touch on my ongoing research on it. It's not 100% complete yet, but it's a work in progress, and we can together think about some of the issues that I'm going to raise tonight. My research in general is based solely on critical theory, and I try to bring critical theory to mainstream political science. And now you will hear from me some of my thoughts on mediation and peace building and peace agreements, and how we can try to reconceptualize some of these theories and literature from a critical theory perspective. And since I can't really cover everything during the presentation, most of what you want, or some of you what some of you expect to hear, will come up during the question and answer period. So everything eventually will be talked about, hopefully, before we go home tonight. So mediation efforts leading to peace agreements are a feature of contemporary peacemaking. Peacemaking is defined here as the efforts conducted by any actor through mediation or negotiations to resolve via peace agreements the internal and external, contemporary and historic, economic, political, and social causes of civil war. Since the end of the Cold War, the use of mediation as a way of reaching peace settlements between warring factions has become the standard option for the international community. The increase in the practice of peacemaking as a form of conflict resolution has been noted in the scholarly field. Collective bodies such as the United Nations and the African Union have recently institutionalized support offices for mediation and peace operations. In addition, mediation and peace processes practice have also been frequently pursued by states as part of their foreign policy toolkit. Am I speaking loud enough for you? All right. A toolkit, and let me just go back again. In addition, mediation and processes practices have also been frequently pursued by states as part of their foreign policy toolkit, not least to promote foreign policy interests. However, efforts by the UN or AU to settle armed conflicts have occasionally been misused by the United States and its Western allies to advance their national interests at the expense of collective neutrality and local ownership of mediation. This raises the question of whether peace processes are as natural as many assume they are, or whether such frameworks simply form part of a wider third-party interest. Critical theory research suggests that Western-led mediation processes have become an arena for third-party power practices and ideologies of civil war, and that there has been little attention paid to how biased mediators affect the provisions of peace agreements, and how that in turn affects the quality of peace and stability in countries emerging from conflicts. While this critique is valid, this presentation contends that the critique is not enough. Whereas much of the literature on mediation is often focused on the functions of mediation and on the sequencing of peace processes, less attention is devoted on how interests and ideology affect the subsequent peace-building phase. In fact, the technical approaches to the study of peace agreements are problematic because they are unable to explain why social conflicts often persist, even though a peace agreement is signed. I argue that the motives behind the design of peace processes and peace agreements have far-reaching implications for peace building. Beyond illustrating how tensions are sometimes built into agreements and how third-party actors sometimes regulate agreements to their advantage to influence the post-conflict order, I also argue that there is a case to be made for a debate on the interconnectedness between peace building and the problems of the liberal peace. Despite the wealth of contributions on the external interventions by and practices of Western peace building, many scholars tend to over-rely in their conclusions on the findings from the so-called post-agreement phase of interventions. As more critical scholars have begun to note, it is often problematic that many problem-solving studies on peacemaking and peace building seldom reflect on the motives of ideological underpinning of the policy solutions that are embedded in external interventions. As a result, Most mainstream peace-building literature to date has paid limited attention to the linkages that exist between discourses and practices in negotiation and post-peace agreement phases of intervention. This is a shortcoming, as some of the problems and contradictions that surface in the implementation phase are often embedded in the process during the peace negotiations. Therefore, I intend to further highlight what this connection looks like and to explain why it matters for our understanding of peacemaking and its practice. By linking the motives and practices of interveners during the negotiation and implementation phases into a sharper and more integrated theoretical framework, I hope to provide input into the debate on liberal models of peacemaking and peace building, their application in different cases and contexts, and any available alternative. Moreover, the self-interest of individual mediators and of political mediators, such as the state, is likely to play an important role in shaping the ensuing peace. For example, there is often an underlying ideological agenda or normative tradition in which the mediator operates. The normative element of a peace process is rarely publicly articulated, either in practice or in theory. On the contrary, it can operate in a concealed or disguised way through underlying norms, principles, orders, and practices. As noted by Brockovich, the self-interest of mediators causes them to do something about a conflict whose continuance could adversely affect their own political interests or, for instance, preserve intact a structure of which they are part, or to pursue mediation as a way of extending and enhancing their own influence by becoming indispensable to the parties in conflict. In the mediation practices of powerful third parties, the mediator may try to conceal its power by presenting its own role as consensual and in line with what the other parties want. For example, according to the National Security Advisor under US President Bill Clinton, power brokering is about convincing a party to do what you want him to do, an effort to make the other think doing something you want as his idea rather than yours. However, it is highly uncertain whether such an approach can pave the way for a durable and self-sustaining peace. While some research attention has been directed to biased mediators and biased peace processes, few in-depth case studies illustrated the tensions these may cause in the research for durable conflict resolution and self-sustaining peace. Reaching an agreement on the conditions for peace usually heralds an end to the peacemaking phase of the peace process if it results in the cessation of hostilities. This is the point where the peace-building stage of the peace process starts, dealing with the consolidation of the peace. The agreement provides for the subsequent implementation of arrangement and provides a framework for peace building. The peace agreement with its provisions, regulations, and principles can thus be considered crucial to shaping not only peace-building practices, but also social conditions which peace rests upon. From this perspective, problems related to implementation and peace-building could be related to the norms, spirit, and concrete key provisions of the agreement. The current problem is not whether mediators are biased or not, or do they address the root causes of conflict in peace agreements or not, but when they do, what type of root causes do they address? Why do outsiders only consider the internal root causes of conflict? Should we not be asking instead whether international mediation and peace operations, owing to their imperial interests, are deliberately focusing on internal causes to end civil wars, therefore creating a world that is less stable than more? Root causes are defined here as past or current, external and internal factors that result in the nature, the magnitude, the location, and the timing of conflicts. The overall focus of this study is to contribute to the debate on how third-party mediation identifies the root causes of a conflict and how it determines what behavior, actions, inactions, or conditions needs to be addressed in the peace agreement to prevent the recurrence of conflict. Research on the root causes of civil wars has no shortage of explanations. However, the ontological and epistemological premises of the knowledge on root causes and civil wars is problematic. Research findings led academics and practitioners to attribute war in Africa and elsewhere to causes that are internal to countries, thereby referring to such violence in the deceptively neutral term civil war. deceptively neutral term civil war. Consequently, Western third-party mediators involved in negotiating peace agreements tend to focus on the combatants failing to recognize or address in the provisions of the peace agreement the extent to which civil war is rooted in historical and imperial practices. Ultimately, this narrow focus leads to a partial resolution and therefore weak peace agreements. My research addresses this problematic core assumption through the examination of comprehensive peace agreements in Sudan known as the CPA, signed in 2005, seeking to contribute to a rethinking of how the provisions of peace agreements are designed to address the root causes of protracted civil wars and economic, political, social crises in post-colonial Africa. This research intervenes in such debate through the use of a distinct post-colonial methodological and analytical approach. It examines two related frameworks overlooked by the conventional framing of civil war. First, the practices of colonialism, which replanted the seeds and planted the seeds of racial, religious, and ethnic cleavages that were cultivated and utilized in the form of post-colonial wars over power and resources. And second, the role of imperialism in the form of geopolitics of Cold War and more recently the war on terror in instigating conflicts in Sudan and elsewhere. It is partly habitual to refer to political violence in Africa as civil war, but this concept might be ideologically and politically convenient. Deceitful terms such as civil wars contribute to the formation of a specific brand of ontology and epistemology that not just shapes the production of knowledge, but its objectives. It obscures what is viewed and how it is interpreted. Critical scholars have argued that classification systems are generally determined by some purpose. They are not neutral, and they should always be questioned. Therefore, the examination of ontological and epistemological positions as well as ideological frameworks in the social sciences should continue to be scrutinized by critical analysis. This ought to be the case in the study of conflict resolution as well. Here, too, what matters is whether or not a set of categories hide more than it reveals. This presentation contends that third-party mediators utilizing the common ideology of civil war and the assumption that the principal causes of political violence are mostly due to internal factors deliberately discount the role of Western structures of hegemony and exploitation. As such, the assumption that all the root causes of civil war are internal legitimizes the imperial narratives which claim that war and underdevelopment result solely from the incompetence of third world leaders and or their inept systems. Simultaneously, the Western-led international community is portrayed as the unconditional protector of all civilian victims, the impartial agent of peace, the zealot of the rule of law, and the promoter of reconciliation. For durable peace agreements, it is vital that mediators acknowledge that the sources of the production and the reproduction of war are to be found not only in the internal characteristics of individual states, but in their historical and contemporary economic, political, and social experiences with global powers. In particular, that political violence in Africa is to be associated with and understood in relation with its past experiences with colonialism, understood here as the takeover of territory, appropriation of material resources, exploitation of labor, and interference with political and cultural structures of another territory or nation, and current imperialism defined here as a global system of processes which lead to domination and control. This power to rule has been and continues to be embodied variously in regimes of governance and authority, military power, finance, property, socialization, knowledge, and so on. My research does not seek to argue that domestic factors are simply the product of a state's location within the global imperial order. Rather, this research argues for an understanding of political violence and war that is partially founded in global structures of power and the history of imperialism. The global here is understood as the local, domestic, regional, and international relations and exchanges. Accordingly, the abstraction of internal factors as the only source of conflict constitutes a form of analytical violence in that it disassembles and falsifies reality. Such abstraction does not constitute a benign neglect. Indeed, critical theorists in the peace-building subfield have long acknowledged the role of external actors in internal wars. However, a critique of these external factors ceases to exist in mediation theory, whilst empirically unsustainable, the claim that the principal causes of conflict are intrinsic to the domestic sphere underpins political quasi-civilizational interventions and world ordering by Western powers and their mediators as a requisite condition for the attainment of the collective good. The ideology of civil war enables the self-appointed international community to adopt selectively a position of their powerless righteousness in favor of a professed humanitarian, impartial, and conciliatory engagement. As such, the ideology of civil war affords a legitimating function in the long history of imperial recourse to moral obligation or duty clocked in the language of universal values of salvation, emancipation, modernization, development, good governance, democratization, human rights, peace building, and so on. It is not the intention of this research to absolve local actors from having agency in conflicts of their own countries. Let me repeat that again. It is not the intention of this research to absolve local actors from having agency in the conflicts of their countries. There is ample research, for example, conducted on the role of internal actors in instigating and exacerbating conflicts in Sudan and elsewhere, for example. The intention of this paper is to shed light on the role of external actors in civil war and critically analyze why these external factors are not problematized in root causes theories, mediation theories, theories of peace agreements, and the consequences of that on the quality of peace agreements. Now let's go over some of the theories on the causes of war. As mentioned, the ideology of civil war and the privileging of internality have attained particular salience in the post-Cold War period. From the end of the Second World War until the late 1980s, Western powers and their Soviet bloc rivals had systematically projected the logic of the Cold War onto most conflicts, thereby investing virtually all wars and insurgencies with a political and ideological stake. The assessment of these conflicts was influenced by the political allegiance of the concerned parties, but the political character and the role of the external forces in such proxy wars was readily evident. With the end of the Cold War and the end of history, accounts of international disorder could no longer be ascribed to an expansionary communism. Academia and practitioners alike pretended as if external causes of civil wars ended with the end of the Cold War. The global structures of exploitation and inequalities that prevailed were not seen as continuous contributing factors to civil wars, nor was the ripple effect of previous proxy wars considered. Any civil war that started after the end of the Cold War must have been a result of an internal problems, as argued in the literature. Most prominent among these research efforts was the World Bank, which grew increasingly concerned during the 1990s, particularly under the presidency of James Wolfson, about the costs of civil war. The World Bank set up a research unit led by the British Africanist economist Paul Collier on the economics of crime, violence, and civil war. Second was the Carnegie Corporation of New York under the presidency of David Hamburg. He sought to place prevention on the policy agenda for largely ethical and humanitarian concerns, but also pragmatic and cost-benefit ones, prevention being less costly. Hamburg created the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, which issued massive series of studies and overall reports on conflict prevention. Third was the US government through the Office of the Vice President Al Gore, which was persuaded by academic researchers that early warning was both possible and less costly than intervention to stop the fighting. Through funding and authorization by the Central Intelligence Agency, Directorate of the Intelligence, CIA, a task force to study state failure, later changed to political instability, and the name changed to political instability, was created to mobilize US academic analysis on the causes of civil war as a means of early warning. It is currently in its fifth panel of data collections and analysis. At the same time, the two UN secretaries General, in this period, Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Kofi Annan gave substantial emphasis to the problem of conflict prevention in speeches and UN documents. By the late 1990s, official development agencies such as the UK Department of International Development, DFID, and the US Agency for International Development, USAID, also turned their attention to what they called conflict in general, with separate bureaus and the development of conflict assessment tools in particular. This international security effort emerged, arguing that internal wars reflected in the past international conflict. With the end of the Cold War, ideological conflicts have disappeared, as Fukuyama argued in 1992, and been replaced by conflicts over identity and civilization defined by religious beliefs and cultures. Thus, various explanations have emerged to account for conflict and crisis, explanations that have been largely internal. Indeed, Chester Crocker, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, is explicit in foregrounding internality. With the end of the Cold War, he argues, the very nature of conflict changed. Conflict became internal. Particularly pervasive amongst these narrow-minded explanations of conflict have been the primordialism thesis, whereby conflicts are officially attributed to the existence of old and intractable bad blood between neighboring and intertwined communities, and relatedly the exploitation of these ingrained feelings by ruthless warlords. Although the relative significance of group antagonisms and the actions of self-serving elites varied across conflicts throughout most of the 1990s. On the basis of these views, that such conflicts have been going on for so long and are so emotional, ancient hatreds, as was argued, that no outsider can do much about them. Secretary of State Warren Christopher's famous statement about Bosnia in 1993, the intractable problem from hell, he argued, is a case in point. Essentialist accounts of identity politics continue to exert considerable sway. Constructivists, meanwhile, have argued that identities are not fixed and immutable, but rather socially constructed. As such, identities are said to be exploited by greedy elites for their own individual ends. Despite apparent differences, both narratives nonetheless excogitate identity as an internal root cause of war. Relatedly, Malthusian arguments have posited an escalation of intergroup conflict as a result of increasing population levels, environmental stress, and scarcity, as have accounts which focus on resource abundance or the resource curse, as well as explanations based on relative deprivation and pronounced horizontal inequalities between social groups. However, with new classical economists in time for water. However, with new classical economists increasingly on the analytical warpath, the centrality of individual behavior and the self-serving actions of elites have tended to dominate accounts of political violence, manifest particularly in the claim that greed trumps grievance as the prime cause of conflict. More recent versions of the World Bank analysis have modified this claim, arguing that greed perpetuates war rather than initiating it. As the imperative of war financing spawns entrepreneurs of violence. Nonetheless, the enduring theme of bad leaders echoes the extensive literature on the violent predation and the warlordism, such that theories of post-Cold War violence claim new wars to be apolitical. Violence has freed itself from ideology. Contemporary civil wars, which constitute a form of political retrovirus, are about nothing at all. However, an emerging literature on post-colonial states and the kinds of political conflicts and resulting lines of cleavages created by colonial strategies of rule has been particularly useful in analysis of African conflicts, such as that of Mamdani and Young. In all versions, however, wars are fought over political consequences of cultural differences. The political regime argument, on the other hand, maintains that civil war is caused by authoritarian rule or the absence of democracy. The particular formation of this argument that dominates the policy discussion, however, is largely a refinement of the cultural argument, in which aggrieved minorities defined culturally remain the main players, but the problem lies in the absence of mechanisms for redress. At the same time, like the economic argument, its support comes from aggregate statistical analysis of patterns relating to political instability, including violence to regime type done by the Political Instability Task Force. Public attention to this argument may well have more to do with its strong affinity to an equally public argument during the 1990s, that of democratic peace theory in international relations. But its empirical base is the minorities at risk and the polity database developed at the University of Maryland by Ted Robert Gurr and associates, and the political problems of culturally fragmented or polarized societies. Now let's take a look at the mediation literature. The literature on mediation is often focused on the functions of mediation and on the sequencing of peace processes and strategies. Less attention is devoted to how interests and ideology affect the quality of the peace agreements and its ability to address the external root causes of conflict. What does it mean to mediate in a contemporary world? In the past, various forms of international intervention, from peacekeeping to peace building, state building, and the responsibility to protect doctrine, were either high-level processes essentially used to maintain a fragile strategic and territorially sovereign balance between states and their elite leaders, or to build new states and inculcate new forms using a mixture of diplomacy, direct, or governmental power. International mediation, once a fashionable and widely studied aspect of IR, suffered from having settled into its understanding of an elite and status or power-driven form of impartial mediation facade, embedded in liberal institutionalism and spoken through the medium elite phrased English. In some US and Scandinavian debates, international mediation has continued to draw some interest as a narrow technique that can be theorized through and alongside realism, liberalism, game theory, and other problem-solving approaches. In general, published work has not engaged with the changes that have occurred in the international theory or politics over the last 25 years, nor has it begun to consider the external factors of internal wars. The literature has tended to avoid debates on the link between global structures of power and mediation. There is not yet any engagement with post-colonial theory. Scholars continue to debate as if sovereign states, realism, international diplomacy, and military strategy, liberalism, and norms were unchanged and unchallenged. Therefore, scholars who subscribe to this perspective are primarily concerned with studying and improving different technical policy solutions to remove the obstacles associated with the implementation or externally imposed conflict transformation models, that is, its function. It is not uncommon for such practices to employ positivist methodologies in which the effectiveness of mediation and the quality of the peace agreements are evaluated and tested in terms of a dichotomy of success and failures, while underlying questions of power and interest are seldom critically addressed. In the post-Cold War era, interventions began to mediate the sovereign state and ethnicity with the liberal peace, as in Bosnia. In the case of Sudan, for example, identity, territorial sovereignty, and the nature of governance also began to be mediated, leading to more complex, post-liberal, and pluralist approaches. Still, contemporary mediation and the peace processes it develops seems to have remained anchored in the lost 19th century world of elite, state-centric, and territorialism, power diplomacy, mediated by a set of international statesmen with diplomatic skills to match their power and interests. They aim to mediate territorial sovereignty, power, and state status with interest through discourses converted into legal agreements. This raises an important question. What does it mean to mediate in the 21st century? A dispassionate critical analysis of the effect of mediators' motivation on the provision of peace agreements is remarkably rare because of the principles and thus presumptions of neutrality in peace operations. International mediation has theorized during the Cold War as a literal high-level process that was essentially used to maintain a fragile strategic balance between states and their elite leaders using a mixture of diplomacy, state, and overt power. After the Cold War, it began to be connected not just with maintaining order within the confines of territorial sovereignty, but also with liberal peace and its normative political and economic frameworks within the confines of its existing state system. The democracy, human rights, and free trade. It began to be seen more broadly as a way of settling, resolving, and pacifying differences through diplomacy, law, institutional reform, and thus state and regional design. There are two types of mediations, stage 1 and stage 2, or track 1 and track 2. Track 1 diplomacy, as interstate negotiations are referred to, involves the heads of state and or foreign ministries of national governments. Mediation arrived in modernity through a heritage of mainly European elite diplomacy aimed at defending many privileges embedded in the system as far as possible. This understanding of the role of mediation is embedded in the Westphalian system of sovereignty, which it supports. At the same time, it valorizes the possibilities of elite-led, rational-led discourse, and thus the intellect, knowledge, and communicative skill, along with status and power. Mediators were men withstanding in the international diplomatic system or wielding material power in the state system, as during the Cold War, for example, Henry Kissinger and President Carter. Or with moral standings in the UN system, or moral standings at another level, such as the Vatican during the Beagle Channel dispute. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. There is little to challenge these systems with its epistemological frameworks that tended to adopt problem-solving approaches to maintaining territorial, material, ideological, normative, and hierarchical aspects of the current order. This meant that the discursive and epistemic framework for negotiations and related international mediation processes have been set by a complex mixture of historical Eurocentric diplomatic praxis, realism and liberalism, but civilian populations were generally seen as relatively passive audiences in any peace processes. Thus, a peace process would mainly focus on the consociational arrangements between elites or negotiations over international border and the redistribution of territory, while overlooking global and regional structures of power. Participants in Track 1 diplomacy also include intergovernmental organizations such as the UN and specifically to the Office of the UN Secretary General, and regional organizations such as the African Union and the Organization of American States. During the Cold War years, these organizations were often stymied in their efforts by the dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union. But since 1989, they have taken on a larger role in mediating both interstate and intrastate disputes. Success of peace agreements was then defined as either a basic and an agreed security order, a ceasefire or a new border, for example, and possibly to contribute to a more sophisticated liberal peace framework, for example, a constitutional change. This was to be achieved within the confines of the existing international system, with as few structural implications for the existing state systems as possible. In other words, international mediation was aimed at adjusting local or regional structures, but not international structures of power, which were assumed to be eternal. Its concern with neutrality, impartiality moments, and conflict cycles, and the control of information and resources were framed by the cultural perspective provided by mainstream understanding of diplomacy and its communication and hierarchical ethos, and hence a negative peace. Speared by the realist liberal approaches, they were advocating for a minimal understanding of peace, which meant that they often addressed the wrong issues or problems, leaving existing international power structures intact to battle it out through militarized diplomacy, shaving off key issues by completely missing the foreign causal factors of internal conflicts and focusing on more limited conflict management instead. In practice, Track 1 mediation's limitations have been very obvious. This rationality of mediation concluded that mediators with power were more effective and implicitly became a justification for the excesses of power and foreign intervention by the superpowers. A more significant evolution over the past 25 years has been the increasing role of non-governmental actors as both antagonists and intermediaries in international conflicts. In the decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall, new states emerged from the Soviet and the internal challenges from the Soviet Union, and the internal challenges to these and other state governments increased. Consequently, subnational and transnational identity groups, usually representing such minorities as the Albanians in Serbia or the Armenians in Azerbaijan, demanded recognition and legitimacy. The state-centric apparatus of the international system could not respond adequately to these new players, who were considered illegitimate. So non-governmental conflict resolution organizations expanded to fill in this need. This Track 2 diplomacy was first named and validated by Joseph Montville and Harold Saunders in the 1980s. The 1990s saw a huge increase in the number of such organizations. These Track 2 efforts include interventions by non-governmental organizations, these NGOs, scholars, religious leaders, or former diplomats who are deemed eminent persons. Talks in Mozambique, Northern Ireland, and South Africa all provide examples of effective Track 2 efforts that brought previously demonized groups into the negotiation process that eventually ended in Track 1 peace agreements. The broadening of mediation theory and practices presented some contradictions as a consequence. Though mediation theory began to extend its range from the mere ending of war to the construction of a more positive liberal peace, it was still indicative of an international discourse in which mediation operated in the visible, formal terrain of the state-centric world, albeit states that were to be democratic and respect international law. Clearly, mediation between the like-minded and the putatively liberal actors might provide easier successes, but the engine of the conflict is difference, not sameness. Mediation envisioned within the liberal international order, therefore, has been unable to accept difference. That is, positions outside of the liberal international system, assumed framework of states, the difference outside of the liberal international system's assumed framework of states, right, democracy, and capitalism. A critical review of how the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, known as the CPA in the Sudan, and the way it was designed will illustrate that it included provisions and regulations that had far more dramatic implications for post-conflict peace than generally envisioned by the primary parties. There is much that can be learned from how peace agreements have been mediated and how they can contribute to conflict resolution, but also how peace agreements sometimes lay the foundations for the re-emergence of armed conflict. For instance, the CPA, which was signed in 2005, led to the birth of independent South Sudan, was meant to end the longest fought civil war in Africa between the Sudan and the South Sudan. However, the focus of the agreement was on short-term internal priorities, while little attention was given to addressing the more convoluted internal causes, and certainly no attention was given to the external root causes of the conflict. Not only did Sudan and South Sudan resume fighting each other after the secession of the South in 2011, but internal conflicts in both countries intensified. Clearly, the peace agreement did not address all the root causes of the conflict. As Kostick has argued, power-brokered agreements such as the CPA are frequently combined with a short-term ambition to secure the durability of peace by the inclusion of prevailing Western universal values and norms of state and nation building. These components are frequently imposed automatically through the political agenda of the mediating team, often without much consideration for the particularities of the societies and parties engaged in the peace talks. If the root causes of any civil war lie in international factors, even partially, for example, the changing global economic context, the instability of a region, the strategic policies of major powers, the economic policies supported by donors and banks, the conditions for aid or trade, then the mediation efforts must attempt to rectify these international conditions or actions, not just domestic ones. For the most part, the international conditions and policies that figure most prominently in analysis of other related subfields, such as the peace building, are disregarded by mediating theories. Worse yet, the external powers such as Western states, the World Bank, and the IMF, who would have to reverse these exploitative international conditions and policies, will refuse to reverse them and continue to insist that local actors bear full responsibility for the civil wars in their countries, and they are concurrently acting as third-party mediators in many third world conflicts. Now, the conflict I want to talk a little bit about the peace agreements and what peace agreement mandates and what they include in them. The conflict in South Sudan, in southern Sudan, is only one of many well-known conflicts that have been terminated by a peace agreement in recent years. During the year 2005, peace agreements were concluded in 4 conflicts: Chad, Indonesia, Ivory Coast, and the Sudan. Studying the period after the Cold War, we can identify 144 accords between warring parties covering 1/3 of 121 armed conflicts active since 1989. These agreements solving, regulating, or deciding on a process for regulating the incompatibility between warring parties. There are three types of peace agreements. The first one is and the most clear-cut one is the full agreement, defined as an accord where at least one dyad agrees to settle the whole incompatibility. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2003, the government and all main rebel formations and civil societies actors signed the inter-Congolese political negotiations called the Final Act. This ended the conflict and provided for elections, the interim governance, and a new constitution. There have been 43 full agreements in the studied period. And two, the second type of agreement is called the partial agreement, defined as an accord where the parties in at least one dyad agreed to settle parts of the incompatibility. Some peace processes deal with one issue at the time in partial agreements, and the conflict is not regarded as solved until the final agreement has been signed. In Sudan, for example, partial treaties were signed over security issues, wealth sharing, power sharing, and over the administration of certain areas before a final agreement was concluded, formally ending the peace process. A partial agreement can also be one of the notes outstanding, one that notes outstanding issues to be solved later in later negotiations. The St. Andreas Accord in Mexico, for example, in 1996, dealt with indigenous rights but did not address agrarian reform nor the conditions for ending hostilities. In partial agreements, certain issues can also be delegated to a commission to work out the practical elements of implementation. In Georgia, for another example, a committee was established, chaired by the United Nations, with participation of representatives of Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Russian Federation. It also included international experts. The aim was to reach a comprehensive settlement in the end. Some agreements regulate other political issues than the incompatibility. Therefore, some agreements are treated as partial after comparing the outcome in the written agreement with the stated goal of the parties. For example, the Dunia agreement between armed forces of the Federal Republic called FARF and the government of Chad provided for the transformation of FARF into a political party and its integration into the civil services. Since FARF was fighting for a referendum on the structure of the state and on bilingualism, the agreement did not fully solve the incompatibility at all. There were 79 partial agreements studied in that period. The third type is called the peace process agreement, an accord where at least one conflict dyad agrees to initiate a process that settles the incompatibility. A typical peace process agreement has a detailed agenda for talks, but in some of the parties only agree to initiate negotiations as substantial issues, such as the territorial status of a region. In many high-profile peace processes, for instance, the one in Guatemala between 1990 and 1996, a number of agreements dealt with the agenda for the talks before approaching the conflict issues. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program, in short UCDP, reports 22 peace processes agreements for the period of between 1989 and 2005. The UCDP codes two types of incompatibility. The first is government conflicts. These conflicts deal with regime type and the composition of the government. The second is called the territorial conflicts. Here, the incompatibility concerns the status of a territory, and many include demands for secession or autonomy. Over 2/3 of peace agreements were signed in government conflicts, although most conflicts were fought over territory. A typical peace process in a conflict over government includes more partial agreements than a process in a conflict over territory. And follow-up agreements concluded after previous agreements have failed to be implemented are also more common. Now, let me talk about some features of peace agreements. The military provisions of peace agreements, such as the ceasefire between warring parties, is often regarded as a principal objective in a peace process. However, in some conflicts, the parties had already agreed to end violence before starting negotiations on substantial issues. In other cases, cessation of hostilities was included only in the final agreement. Either way, formal ceasefires were included in 60% of the 100 44 peace agreements. 6 of the 10 also provided for the demobilization of troops and for disarmament. Some agreements went even further and included the integration of former combatants into the national armed forces, whereas 26% of the agreements did not include any military provisions at all. Almost all were partial agreements signed in a peace process where ceasefire or other military provisions were found in separate arrangements. The St. Andrew Accord in Mexico is exceptional as it included a list of issues to be dealt with in talks a month later, but these talks stalled and the accord was never implemented. The parties never agreed on cessation of hostilities, but violence did not restart. Political provisions of peace agreements in interstate government conflicts often provide for elections and have provisions on the composition of an interim government. A number of the agreements grant the warring parties a place in the government or the right to become political parties. These can be seen as elements of democratization, which thus is a feature of solving government conflicts. Researchers have emphasized the power sharing is a logical solution to conflict over governments, but 15% of the peace agreements in governmental conflicts included explicit power sharing provisions. Even when considering only the full agreements, power sharing provisions are not typical. They are found only in 29% of the agreements. It suggests that power sharing is used only in some conflicts, possibly in ethnically divided societies. The most common solution in interstate conflicts over territory was to grant a disputed region local governance or autonomy. For full agreements, the most common provision was to grant extended cultural groups rights or grant the region local governance. No agreement has been granted the secessionist independence. However, some deals gave the right to vote for independence in a referendum. For example, the Papua New Guinea in 2001 and Sudan in 2005. Other typical features are contributions to regional development, local referenda, and creation of a federal state, and provisions of power sharing on the local on the local level. The two agreements signed in interstate armed conflicts were solved by demarcation of the borders. It appears that conflict dealing with government and territory will require different measures of conflict resolution. In some cases, however, the issues can be intertwined, as in the conflict over southern Sudan. In Sudan, the peace process included both agreements stipulating power sharing and agreements granting a referendum on the future status of the South. So let's talk about the Sudan a bit here. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005. This section will briefly examine the third-party mediation efforts that led to the 2005 Comprehensive Agreement, so-called Comprehensive Peace Agreement, by assessing the role of the main drivers of the mediation, which was the Intergovernmental Authority on Drought. It's called IGAD, in short. It's an East Africa intergovernmental organization. They mediating Sudan civil war between 1993 and 2005. In IGAD's 12 years effort in Sudan, it demonstrates how regional mediators were directly involved, along with its Western allies, in flaming the civil war while simultaneously mediating the negotiations as third-party mediators. This example will illustrate how regional actors managed the task of steering Sudan parties to the negotiation table, and how they brought in international actors to assist in the mediation, and how that contributed directly to the secession of South Sudan while serving their interests at the regional level and the international economic and social interests. Members of the opposition groups fighting the government of Sudan at the time gained considerable international support, particularly from the U.S., which at the least saw it as means of weakening the National Islamic Front, in short NIF, the political party of the government, and at most as an instrument for overthrowing the government itself. In response to what was held to be an Islamist threat to the sovereignty, the IGAD mediators, namely Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Uganda, stepped up their military assistance to the Sudanese People Liberation Movement, Army, and by the late 1995 were directly involved in the civil war by sending their armed forces deep into Sudan. In the wake of the attempted assassination of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak by what were believed to be agents of the NIF, the National Islamic Front in Sudan, in June of 1995, in Addis Ababa, the U.S. began assisting the frontline states of the mentioned Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Uganda with $20 million to protect themselves from Khartoum, while they were also mediating the conflict between the North and South. This policy reached its height with the August 1998 US bombing of the Al-Shifa plant in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and the October 1998 meeting of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright with the Sudanese People Liberation Movement leadership in Kampala, Uganda, where she made it clear that the US favored regime change, again, while they were mediating the conflict between the North and the South. President George W. Bush appointment of special peace convoy Senator Danforth, appointment of special peace envoy Senator Danforth to oversee the peace process in Sudan 5 days before September 11 attacks demonstrated growing U.S. concerns about the faltering peace process in Sudan and the danger of what is to be the failed state. Additional pressure was brought to bear by Sudan being identified as one of the 7 countries on the State Department list of state-sponsored terrorism. Interest in Sudan by a number of key constituencies, namely the Congressional Black Council, the Christian right liberals, human rights activists, American humanitarian agencies, and the oil lobby, which was upset at being denied entry into the potentially lucrative oil market in Sudan because of the American embargo, combined with highlighted concerns about international terrorism after September 11, and contributed to the demands of increased U.S. involvement in Sudan. While the human rights activists and the Black Caucus attracted most attention within the Clinton administration, under Bush it was the Christian right, to a lesser extent the oil industry, and most significantly security and intelligence interests. The Christian right had long sympathized with the plight of the southern Sudanese, who were turning to Christianity in growing numbers, and by extension, the Sudanese People Liberation Movement and Army as well, which in turn saw these politically well-connected Christians as valued allies in Washington. In an interview that I had with the assistant to the Kenyan Foreign Affairs in Juba, South Sudan in 2007, he had admitted to me that the Kenyan government used the issue of the religion and the Christian right in the U.S. to pressure the U.S. government into taking a hard line with Sudan, and it worked. Their plan worked. He also mentioned to me that they used the issue of slavery with the Black Caucus in the U.S., and it also helped to add pressure. President Bush himself drew inspirations from the religious groups in his hometown of Midland, Texas, where church leaders pressed him to deepen the U.S. engagement in Sudan. Bush also had a close personal relationship with the evangelist Billy Graham and his son Franklin, who operated their own NGO, Samaritan's Purse in Sudan. In addition, the U.S. oil industry was well placed to influence the Bush administration, since the president and a number of his leading colleagues had close links with the industry. The oil industry was disappointed that the benefits of its efforts in establishing the industry in Sudan were being reaped by a handful of Asian companies, China and Talisman Company of Canada at the time. Thus, it can be surmised that the oil companies urged Bush to achieve a peace agreement in the Sudan that would permit the embargo, to end and provide the necessary security for them to consider operating in Sudan again. The oil industry's interest thus dovetailed with government policy, which linked U.S. security to diversifying its energy sources away from the unstable Middle East and increasing its share of oil from Africa. To conclude, I'm just going to restate some of the points that I made, that saying that it is commonly argued by scholars that the dominant post-Cold War paradigm of liberal peace combines traditional forms of peacekeeping, mediation, and negotiations with the broad arrays of tasks necessary to construct the political and economic institutions of post-conflict states. Weak and failing states and the resulting wars and migrations have been framed as one of the main threats to United States-led international order. To tackle such threats, Western governments have introduced a range of liberal practices into peace agreements. As is highlighted above, building state capacity, the facilitation of democratic elections and the market economy, and the promotion of human rights, justice, and good governance became the cornerstone of the interveners' agenda. Numerous proponents of this type of external intervention claim that these are pursued in order to build peace and alleviate human suffering. The overarching claim is that peace processes and peace agreements in terms of how they address the root causes of conflict and how they treat the primary parties, their participation and their concerns can either lay the foundations for durable peace or engender social tension that complicate and undermine the long-term prospects for domestic ownership of and sustainable a sustainable peace. By maintaining these imperialist ahistorical, ontological, and epistemological positions, dominant Western ideologies deny academics in general and peace scholars in particular the opportunity to thoroughly examine the role of powerful foreign interest in the invention of many of the civil wars in third world countries. Consequently, mediation efforts that do not endeavor to rectify the role of external actors in negotiations are simply fabricating peace and introducing a form of negative peace that would ultimately fail. To reach an agreement between belligerents or to win a war is one thing, but to change a social, political, and economic landscape is another. Effective negotiations should acknowledge the external root causes of conflict and consider a holistic economic, political, social, and historical constraints at the global, regional, and local levels. Put differently, durable positive peace will remain an illusion unless peace agreements resolve all the underlying external and internal conditions causing violent conflicts. Thank you.